The next day in the morning, Elijah, lying on the bed, was talking in sleep. He raised his hand upward, saying moon too far. Also, the pillow Arthur had poofed on his face last night was lying beside the bed while Arthur stood before the mirror wearing the uniform that Director Goodsky gave him. However, the birds were chirping in the morning. Arthur, wearing the uniform, steps ahead in the corridor while the students turn and look toward him. Arthur, standing outside the disciplinary committee office, says to Sylvia, who sits on his shoulder, looks like they are there. He extends his hand to open the door, saying this is it. Let's see what the so-called strongest students of Xyrus Academy look like. As he opened the door, a lion stood before them, roaring at them, and due to its roaring, its saliva fell on Arthur's face. Further, Arthur's facial skin moves backward and Sylvia flies backward, but she grabs Arthur's hair. Then Sylvia moves ahead, sits on Arthur's head, and angrily looks toward the lion while the lion looks toward Sylvia, sighs, and smiles. Also, the lion's saliva was dripping from Arthur's face. After this, Sylvia slaps the lion, and Arthur, wiping his face, steps into the office. The guy stands before them and says, "Well, that didn't go as planned." Arthur, wiping his face, asks him to take it, saying that this was some elaborate plan to see how to think his skin is, and the guy responds that he could say that. After this, the guy stood beside Arthur, smiling, saying it seemed like Director Goodsky had picked up someone interesting, which could have been based on merit. Arthur stepped ahead, and the guy standing behind Arthur asked for a different connection. However, the guy looking into Arthur's eyes says blood doesn't lie, while Arthur, looking toward him, asks to excuse him and hears the guy squeeze his eyes. Then he laughs, saying it's nothing, just an old saying. Then he extends his hand toward Arthur, saying anyway, his name is Kai Crestless, 4th year, and he can call him Kai though. Arthur shakes hands with him and smiles, responding. Arthur Lewin is pleased to make his acquaintance. Then, pointing toward Sylvia, he says, "This is his bond, Sylvia." However, Sylvia, sitting the lion down on the ground, angrily sat beside him on her foot, and the lion was sweating. Kai looks toward his lion, and Sylvia smiles, responding to Arthur. He sees while thinking about what sort of beast can render Grotter so submissive. Meanwhile, a muscle lady emerges from behind, saying another delicate, pretty boy. Both Arthur and Kai turn their head and look toward her. Kai, looking toward that lady, smiled. Also, behind them, Sylvia sat on the lion, and the lion's head down was sweating. However, that muscle lady leaning beside the wall with a folded arm asks why there aren't more real men on this committee. Looking toward her, Arthur remembers Elijah's childhood friend and excitedly asks Helgarth. That muscle lady, angrily looking toward Arthur, asks who in Mother Earth's name is Helgarth. Her name is Doradria Orgard. In the first year, Arthur looks at her sweat. Then he extends his hand and smiles, saying it's nothing nice to meet her, Doradria. He is Arthur Lewin. He is a first year like herself. Let's get along. As he was about to complete his sentence, she slapped Arthur's hand and laughed, saying stop acting so stiff. After this, Kai stood ahead, turning his head and saying, "Come on, the other DC officers are waiting in the other room." After this, the three of them moved to the other room. While on the way, Dorandrea says Arthur's Director Goodsky didn't even tell them his name, let alone give any details. Kai laughs, adding that everybody is pretty curious. Also, Dorandrea was ahead of them, and Arthur and Kai stepped after him. Behind them was Kai's lion, and Sylvia was sleeping on the lion's head. As they arrive near the room and stand outside the room, Dorandrea turns and pulls Arthur's hand and takes him with her. Bam! The room door enters, saying everyone, the last guy, is there. Prince Curtis sits on the couch and sees Arthur get out, saying he knows it. Arthur surprisingly looks toward Curtis. However, Curtis looks toward Arthur and smiles, saying it is him. Arthur and Arthur smile, asking Curtis why he is surprised. After this, Curtis looks toward Kai Grotter and Sylvia, who sit on Girowader's head, and says he knows Kai took Grotter to scare him, but it seems that somehow the opposite has happened. Arthur, looking toward Grotter, asks Curtis if this is his bond. Wait, is this the same world lion he purchased at the auction when they first met? Curtis laughed that they formed an equal contract after he reached a class last year. Arthur shakes hands with Curtis, congratulates him, and says it's feeling good to see him again. Curtis grabs Arthur's hand, laughs, responds likewise, and welcomes him to the disciplinary committee. Dorandrea stood beside them. Sometimes she turned her head and looked toward Arthur, while sometimes she turned her head and looked toward Curtis. Then she surprisingly asked, They knew each other already while Kai stood behind and confusingly smiled. Curtis answers her not. Just he hears Arthur grabbing his hand and surprisingly looking toward Curtis. Meanwhile, Prince Kathleen gets there, steps the stairs, and looks toward Arthur. She says it's good to see him again, Arthur. Moreover, Arthur looks toward her and smiles, responding, "It's good to see her too, Princess Kathleen," and she nods. Meanwhile, a lady with skin hair color stood beside the railing of the stairs, asking if he had forgotten someone. Then she smiled, saying, "Long time no seen, Arthur." Arthur stood before her folded arm and asked if he was sorry if he knew her. She put a hand on her heart and shouted, "It's he, Fairith Ivasar." As soon as he heard her name, he surprisingly beat his fist on his hand and remembered everything. Then he pointed toward her smile, saying Fafi, while she shouted, adding that Fairith and Dorandrea stood behind with other team members laughing. After this, Fairith closes his eyes and puts a hand on her heart, saying she may be a first year like him, but she is still a few years older than him, so please treat her with respect. Arthur turns and scratches his head, smiling, adding that it feels like yesterday when he knocked her out with one punch. This was a good time. Fairith stood behind them and shouted at him. He was doing it on purpose, wasn't he? Meanwhile, a lady with maroon hair wiping her face with a towel gets there, saying it looks like they are the only other strangers, and then she puts her gun aside. Arthur stood there looking toward him while Fairith stood before screaming at him. Then the lady with maroon hair picked up her belt. She is Claire Bladeheart's 6th-year Battle Mage student and the leader of this little ragtag group. Also, a guy standing beside Claire and Arthur, looking toward her, surprisingly asks Bladeheart if perhaps related to Caspian Bladeheart. Claire asked him if he knew her uncle. Arthur waved his hand and smiled, answering no. Then, remembering the fighting time between him and Caspian, he smiles, saying he has just heard many great things about Caspian Bladeheart's strength from his father. She hears Claire buttoning her uniform and smile, answering well, her uncle started training her almost as soon as she awakened. So many of her techniques are similar to his, but she is happy he recognizes his name. After this, the guy beside Claire named Theo comes to Arthur, and Arthur surprisingly looks toward him. Then he looks toward Arthur and says it seems the disciplinary committee has stooped low enough to recruit twerps. Then he lifts his hand before Arthur, and Arthur extends it toward him, and they shake hands. Theo grabs Arthur's hand and presses it. Arthur surprisingly thinks this is gravity magic. Is he testing him? However, Arthur grits his teeth and uses his fire magic, thinking of it. He didn't think he would be standing right now if it was for his body assimilation with Sylvia's beast will. Using his magic, Arthur stands before him, grabs his hand, and sees Curtis humming while Fairith grits his teeth and other team members silently look toward both of them. After shaking hands with Arthur, Theo looks toward his hand and says not wrong. However, Kai stood behind, looking toward Arthur, and that guy clapped, adding that there was more to Arthur than a pretty face. Arthur stood before that guy, waved his hand, and then Kai smiled, adding Fafi over there and fell face first into the ground when Theo did that to him. Kai's words stab in Fairith's head, and she angrily squeezes her eyes. Then, pointing toward them, she shouts she is a conjurer and Arthur is an augmenter. Please don't compare her to that wild animal like him. Meanwhile, Claire grabbed Fairith and Kai's shoulders, smiling and saying enough, screaming around. She then looks toward Fairith and says they must put their game faces on for the Club Rush announcement. She hears Fairith grit his teeth, and then Claire laughs, adding that this will be the first time the disciplinary committee officers show their faces to the student body. Here's Arthur asks, wait, he wasn't aware of this. He hadn't prepared anything. Claire replies that Arthur has nothing to prepare, and Curtis smiles, adding that the student council will make the announcement. All they have to do is walk in and look tough. Also, Princess Coddle stood beside her brother and nodded. Looking toward Sylvia, who was sleeping on the lion's head, Arthur said he was sure having a giant A-class mana beast beside them would help them. Moreover, Claire claps, adding all right. Then she opens her arms and says, let's show all the entitled students out there what they will be up against if they choose to break the rules. After some time, Tesha was giving her speech in the hall, and she stood beside the rostrum, adding that all of the rules of the Club Rush had been stated. The Student Council would like to formally introduce a committee handpicked by the director to resolve and prevent student disputes and enforce punishment for troublemakers to uphold peace and safety for all students. She hears the students murmuring, and Tesha points aside toward disciplinary committee members who step on the stage and say, please join her in welcoming them to the disciplinary committee. After some time in the classroom, students sit on their seats to take the lecture, murmuring a brown-haired girl looking toward Arthur. She asked her friend if she wasn't one of the DC officers they saw yesterday. Her friend sits beside her with orange hair and answers yes at the club rush ceremony. She thinks his name is Arthur. Also, a girl sitting on the bench beside them was head down, sleeping on the other side. The boys looking toward Arthur were murmuring. One of the boys with green hair and folded arms says a first-year scholar mage is getting into the DC. He's got to have connections, and his friend stood beside him, responding he was just jealous because he also applied for it. Further, he says he heard that all the DC officers must be super strong though. As students discussed Arthur's eyes, Elijah stood beside them, putting a hand on his shoulder and asking how popular he is, Mr. Tufim DC's officer. With a tired facial expression, Arthur answered he thought the disciplinary committee would get less attention. Here's Elijah says it sure doesn't help that he is one of only 8 students who have a black uniform in this entire school. Meanwhile, the professor entered the classroom while the students laughed and chattered. Looking toward the professor, Arthur thinks a conjurer with enough control over his core that he can't sense his level. However, the professor holding the book came to rostrum while the students were still chattering. He sees the professor thump the book on the rostrum and silence spreads there as the students get silent. Then the professor, putting their hand on his chest, says, now that he has everyone's attention, allow him to welcome everyone to the fundamentals of mana theory, and he is Professor Avius. Moreover, he says there may be other more interesting topics they are not all quietly gossiping about. He would like to borrow their attention for the duration of this class. After this, he picks the whiteboard chalk from the rostrum and turns, saying that this is technically an introductory class. He believes they must know many topics they will cover this semester. Professor Avius started writing on the board, saying and further emphasizing that he would be sure to give out plenty of fun projects and assignments along the way. While the students sat there, they were surprisingly looking toward the board. Professor Avius, while writing, says in light of the new changes starting this year. After writing the topic on the board, he turned and looked toward the students. He rattled the chalk with the board. He thinks it's appropriate to discuss what started the whole conjurer, which is better than Augmenter's stigma. Further, he says that when achieving even an orange core was considered extremely difficult in the olden days, conjurers had a huge advantage over augmenters. However, the students noted down the lecture's Elijah while attentively listening to the lecture notes and nodding. Then, Professor Avius says physiologically, conjurers have much more developed mana veins responsible for absorbing ambient mana and transporting it to the mana core. Meanwhile, augmenters naturally have more developed mana channels, which are responsible for the distribution of mana from the mage's core out of the rest of their body because of how much more efficiently conjurers can absorb the mana around them. Moreover, the professor explained that it is much easier for them to ascend to higher core levels. But as both types of mages ascend to higher core levels, the distinction becomes less pronounced. As Professor Avius was giving the lecture, and during the lecture, 2 girls were gossiping. Sees this, Professor Avius points the mana he created in his hand toward those 2 girls, saying conjurers will be able to distribute their mana throughout their bodies more efficiently. While augmenters will have better control over manipulating mana remotely, the girls looking toward the mana in pointed form and coming toward them get scared. The mana hits them and turns into feathers, while the girls fearfully put their hands over their faces. The feather flies downward, and Professor Avius, looking toward both girls, asks students to tell him, class, if in the end, 2 mages, 1 conjurer, and 1 augmenter both reach the silver core stage, then who would have the advantage? Further, he asks if the mage that trains his core and his body not only bigger advantage. However, the rest of the class went on with some of the conjurer students in their class arguing against Professor Avius's claim. The debate could only use hypotheticals and previously recorded duels between high-ranking mages. The discussion did seem to leave the students with an open mind. However, Elijah and Arthur get separated for the following lecture when the class ends. Elijah steps ahead, turns, and looks toward Arthur, waving their hand. He asks if his next class is this way, but he will see him at lunch. Arthur's waving hand responds, save him a spot in line if he gets there first. Also, Sylvia, sitting on Arthur's head, excitedly waved her hand toward Elijah. After this, both Arthur and Sylvia move from there to the next class. As Arthur enters the class, he looks toward the classroom and thinks it looks like this class might be a bit more interesting. Arthur steps ahead and sits on the bench there. While sitting there, he takes tongs, thinking it's been a while since he had to sit down for so long. Meanwhile, Princess Kathleen comes to him, asking if she may sit there. Arthur, while taking tong, surprisingly looked toward her. While the students pass by, they stop there and look toward Princess Kathleen. Arthur looks toward her and thinks there are so many other seats, though she answers sure, go ahead, and she, sitting beside him, thanks him. After this, Kathleen surprisingly looks toward Sylvia, and Sylvia sits on the table and looks toward her. Then she turns her head, saying cute. While Sylvia and Arthur surprisingly look toward her, Fairith gets there, saying look who they have there. Arthur, Sylvia, and Kathleen turn their head and look toward him. Fairith, with a smiley face, asks Arthur if it isn't Princess Kathleen, and his rival Arthur, surprisingly, asks since when they were rivals. Fairith sits next to Arthur while Arthur looks toward him, thinking why he is sitting next to him too. Meanwhile, the lecture starts, and Professor Geist stands in the hall before the students say he knows his class will be popular, but they have quite a crowd of students. Arthur recognizes the professor and looks toward him, thinking, isn't that the one whom he bumps while returning from Gideon? With a smiley face, the professor looks toward the students and says, as they all know, that this class is practical mana manipulation. This means they will be doing things practically. By that, he means through example. Then the professor, looking around in the class toward students, asks what better way to learn than through hands-on experience. However, the professor, looking toward all the girls in the class, excitedly grits his teeth, thinking there are quite a few cuties. Suddenly, among the students, he notices Arthur, and looking toward him, abuses him in his mind. He thinks that he's the idiot who humiliated him. So he goes to this school, then smiles, thinking ideally, he will have plenty of chances to make a fool of him. After this, the professor opens arms and looks toward Arthur, saying it's an honor to teach their disciplinary committee. She hears Arthur sit there with folded arms and what's that drunk planning while Fairith sits beside him, hearing Professor's words and smiling. Then the professor, pointing toward Arthur, Kathleen, and Fairith, asks, but he can't be the only one curious as to what sort of ability the members of their newly formed DC can boast, right? Furthermore, he smiles, saying they will be responsible for protecting all Academy students. He hears Arthur press his lips and looks down, thinking what kind of idiot would fall for an obvious bait. Meanwhile, Fairith raises his hand, saying he volunteered. With an angry face, Arthur looks toward Fairith and thinks he guessed this kind of idiot. After this, Fairith gets up, puts a hand on his heart, and says he is Fairith Ifsar III and is more than willing to do it on behalf of the disciplinary committee, whose members have been chosen personally by Director Goodsky to demonstrate their abilities. He hears Arthur sit beside him, sighs, and looks toward him, and the professor thinks so easily. Then the professor responds that it's more like it. Then he asks Fairith right and asks him to come down to the stage. Fairith came down the stage and stood before Professor bent before him, saying it was an honor to receive his teaching. And because he can't sense his mana core level, he assumes his level must be higher than his own. Professor stood before him, putting hands on his waist, then extended his hand and created the mana, saying he is an augmenter. He will only use a long-range attack in this demonstration, and then the professor, with the help of his mana, will take out his sword. After this, the professor stood there, placing the tip of his sword on the floor, then he turned and looked toward the students, who winked and smiled, saying this way. If he was to lose, he would at least have an excuse to hear the student laugh. However, the professor pipped the yellow item and, holding it in his hand, asks with the barrier activated begin. Fairith took out his magic wand and created the magic, answering his pleasure. Then he swung his wand and created the flood domain magic. Arthur sits there looking toward them, smiling, thinking a higher-tiered spell that adjusts the territory to be more advantageous to the caster. Didn't think Fairith would know a domain spell. Fairith, with his magic, creates the water serpent, sees the professor creating his magic, and thinks it too quickly. Fairith, creating his magic, moves toward the professor while the professor looks toward him, creating his blue flame magic smile. Arthur, watching this all, thinks he guessed the drunk isn't all talk if he can conjure blue flames. Fairith throws his water serpent magic toward him, and in response, the professor throws his blue flame toward him. Both of their magic collapses. Fairith's water serpent starts to fade, and the professor's blue flame moves toward him. The professor makes the fist of his hand move his index finger ahead, and with his finger gesture, the flame cracks with Faerith. However, Faerith thud backward on the water serpent, and his legs burn due to that flame. As Faerith sits injured, his water serpent magic surrounds him, while the professor steps toward him, sees Faerith's head down, and raises his hand, saying he concedes. Arthur presses his lips, thinking he is just trying to boost his ego by purposely humiliating Faerith. Holding his blue flame magic in his hand, the professor turns his head and looks at Arthur with an evil smile. After this, Faerith returns to his seat with a sad face, and Arthur sits there looking toward him, appreciating, saying he did well. However, the professor stood on the stage, opening his arms, saying let this be a lesson to all of them. He had assumed that with his elemental advantage, Mr. Delphaerith Ivsar could protect himself against his spell. Further, he says he had misjudged. Then, smiling, the professor asked if anyone from the disciplinary committee would answer as he was about to complete his sentence. Kathleen got up from her seat. Arthur sits beside her and surprisingly looks toward her while Kathleen raises her hand. She would like to volunteer. Faerith surprisingly calls Kathleen's name, and looking toward her, the professor thinks he didn't think the girl would volunteer too. Arthur sits there, remembers the time when Kathleen, with her magic, saves them, and thinks she has an affinity toward ice magic. She has just witnessed Geist's fire attributes, and yet. As Kathleen steps the stairs, she goes down the stage, and Faerith gets up from the seat and raises his voice. Kathleen, maybe it's best not to while Arthur silently watches this all. After this, Kathleen and the professor stand before each other on the stage, and the professor, looking toward her, says this is quite the honor princess. Then he put a hand on his heart and before her, saying, whatever the result of this demonstration, may please don't hold it against him. Kathleen nods, creates the magic with her dimension ring, and pulls out the magic wand from her ring. Professor, looking toward her, pressing his lips, thinks not much reaction from this one no matter what. However, the professor folded his hands and created the blue flame magic. Then he created the blue flame in either of his hands. He smiled, saying let them proceed. Kathleen lifted her wand and created the ice missile with her magic, saying fire. The missile moves toward the professor while the professor raises his arms before his face. The missile collides with the blue flame and melts, and the professor holding his blue flame smiles, impressive as expected of their princess. However, Kathleen creates more ice missiles with her magic wand and throws these missiles toward the professor. On the other side, the professor threw a fireball toward her missile. Both the ice missile and fireball collide with each other and explode. Arthur sits there watching that fight and thinks, isn't that the spell Lucas used during his rank examination? However, Princess Kathleen, with her magic, creates the ice spear and asks it to break the spear break, and the ice missile moves toward the professor. The professor, looking toward those ice missiles approaching him, thinks the clever girl was breaking apart her ice spear to make a smaller missile. As she was sending her ice missile toward him in response, he angrily gritted his teeth, created his Ember Wisp flame ball, and threw it toward the missile, thinking, but that won't work on him. Moreover, she pointed her wand toward him to create an ice tornado. The ice tornado started twirling, and the professor's flame balls surrounded it. Also, the professor throws his fire bullets toward her. She sees the fire bullets coming toward her, and she is surprised. Faerith gets up from the seat and shouts what she is. Arthur quickly moves from there, and the professor, twirling his flame ball, surprisingly looks toward her, thinking about why she isn't defending herself. Kathleen silently stood there while the fire bullets were moving toward her. Faerith shouts, calling her name. Meanwhile, the fire bullets surround her. However, Arthur gets there and cracks the fireball with his magic, and an explosion occurs there. While the professor stood there, he extended his hand, and all the students got scared. Faerith also got up from his seat. As the explosion ends, the smoke fades, and she disappears there. The professor surprisingly looks toward the area where the explosion occurs and thinks, where is she? Then he turns his eyes and looks around, thinking about where she is. Suddenly, his eyes fall on beside the wall. She sits on the floor while Arthur stands beside her, creating his wind magic. After this, Arthur turns and, looking toward him, says he thinks this little game of his has gone on long enough, then asks him if he agrees. The professor angrily looks toward him, grits his teeth, and then answers while he appreciates his concern for the princess, it is necessary. He had everything under control. Arthur asked for control, and the professor answered of course. Then he asks Arthur if he thinks he, a professor at this esteemed academy, would put one of his students in harm's way. Some students sit there and think that's true, while others think maybe he overreacted. However, the professor closing eyes and opened his arms, saying he was about to cancel it on the spot. He hears Arthur angrily looking toward him, abusing him in his mind, thinking once fully manifested, it is impossible to cancel that spell. Then he turns and looks toward Kathleen, who sits behind him on the floor. He thinks that Kathleen isn't hurt and that he has no proof. After this, Arthur angrily looks toward him and turns his eyes, responding so be it in that case. While the professor, surprisingly looking toward Arthur, thinks he will just have to force him to screw up on him. Arthur completes his sentence by allowing him to replace his colleague in this demonstration. He hears the professor smile and answers well if he insists. Then the professor, looking toward Arthur, says it seems the princess is done anyway. Meanwhile, Princess Kathleen gets up from the ground. She looked down and brushed her clothes. Also, there were scratches on her face. The professor, looking at her, says, "Please don't misunderstand him, princess. He would never hurt her." Kathleen turned and stepped ahead, and Arthur stood behind her, asks her if she was okay. As Arthur asked, she stopped there and then turned her head. Answer his assistance was unnecessary, but thanks him all the same. He hears Arthur smile, then turn his head and stand before the professor, asking him, "Now then, professor." After this, Arthur, with his magic, takes out his transparent sword and angrily looks toward the professor, says please allow him the privilege of learning from him firsthand. Also, his eyes glow, and a light green aura emerges from his body. However, Arthur stood before him, holding his sword, and all the students sitting there were ready to watch that duel. Phaenix's folded arms sit there. Princess Kathleen sits beside him, while Sylvia sits between them on the table before them. The professor, with an evil smile on his face, says Arthur, quite an excellent weapon he has got there, then he turns and steps toward his sword, which he stabbed on the floor. He says since he is an augmenter, he supposes it's only fair to let him choose which method he would like him to use to fight. Arthur, looking ahead, answers that it doesn't matter. He hears the professor freeze there and grits his teeth, abusing Arthur in his mind. And then he turns and, with a smiley face, says he insists. With no expression, Arthur responds that he should use whatever he is most confident in. The professor pries his sword, saying very well, then twirls it in the air and clenches its handle. Then, with his blue flame magic, he burns his sword, saying he will surely go easy on him. Saying this, the professor dashed toward Arthur. While Arthur stood there, he turned his head and swung his sword. However, both of their swords clank, and both of them stand before each other angrily, looking into each other's eyes. Arthur slashed his sword and the professor backward while Arthur stood before him, looking toward him, thinking going easy. After this, the professor firms his flame sword and dashes toward Arthur, while Arthur slashes his sword. He sees the professor swing his sword to attack Arthur, but Arthur, within a second, moves from one side to another. He sees the professor swinging his sword and grits his teeth, thinking he is not using any spells, just strengthening his body and sword with mana. As Arthur steps toward Professor, the professor dashes toward him, thinking, who does he take him for? Professor swinging his sword at him. He is sure the disciplinary committee isn't made only of rats who keep dodging and running away. However, the professor keeps swinging his flame sword toward Arthur, while Arthur continuously steps backward. After this, Arthur, stepping backward, asks him if he needs to attack when their esteemed professor can't even land a single blow on a first-year student. He hears the professor angrily grit his teeth and abuse Arthur in his mind. After this, he creates the flame ball in his hand, while Arthur, using his magic, starts shining, and he draws a circle with his mana around him. The professor runs toward Arthur and circulates him to see Arthur turn his eyes and look toward him. Therefore, the professor swings his flame sword at Arthur, while Arthur, in time, bends backward and the sword passes over him. As Arthur's body was shining, he tapped his hand on the floor in which he held the sword while the professor sent the flame storm toward Arthur. Moreover, Arthur cuts that flame storm with his sword while the professor leaps in the air. After this, the professor slashes his flame hand on Arthur, but Arthur, in time, moves backward and sees the professor angrily and looks toward him. While the students sit there, they are surprised, and Phaenix, putting his hand on the table before him, thinks it doesn't look like a demonstration, so they should get the student council. With his flame magic, the professor creates the flame fall which comes out from the floor and moves upward, and then the professor runs toward Arthur, swinging his flame sword. While Arthur steps backward, the professor strikes his sword toward Arthur, but Arthur puts his sword before him, and the professor's sword clangs with Arthur's sword. As the duel continued between the two, Professor skid, while this time Arthur, slashing his sword, ran toward him. Arthur struck his sword on him as the sword passed by the professor's neck, and in time, the professor slipped backward. Then, angrily looking toward Arthur, gritting his teeth, he thought this idiot got faster. With his shining body head down, Arthur says even rats become deadly when cornered. Then Arthur extends his sword toward the professor and calls him. However, the professor angrily looks toward Arthur, and Arthur dashes toward him, swinging his sword. While the professor stands before him, Arthur gets scared, and with Arthur's strong aura, Arthur comes close to the professor and slashes his sword. Arthur's sword clashes with the professor's sword, and the professor starts staggering. While Arthur swings his sword, he moves toward the professor and sees Princess Catherine and Phainith surprised. Catherine says Arthur is pushing Professor Geist back, and Phainith gets up from the seat, surprisingly responding that he is on a different level. Arthur swings his sword and steps toward the professor, while the professor moves backward. Using his magic, the professor opens the shield and creates it around them. He sees Arthur smile, thinking it is time to end this. Arthur clangs his sword while the professor moves backward, and then the professor swings his sword toward Arthur. In response, Arthur swings his sword, and then both swords ring. Arthur dashes toward Professor. While the professor places his sword before him, Arthur strikes his sword and both swords clang. As the duel continued between the two, the professor asked if he thought this was enough. Arthur swung his sword and answered no. However, Arthur striking his magic sword creates the magic tempest, while the professor, holding his flame sword, moves backward. With his magic, Arthur creates the magic tempest saying, "But this might be," and then he moves his tempest toward the professor. While the professor places his sword before him, he moves backward. Arthur, sending his magic tempest toward him, steps ahead. The professor tries to stop that storm with his sword, but Arthur's magic tempest pushes the professor backward and leans him against the shield wall. As the storm was so strong and making the professor backward, the shield wall beside the professor started to crack. The professor thuds with the shield and sees Arthur smile. The wall begins to crack, and the professor's neck gets scratched due to magic tempest. He places his sword before him and raises his voice to stop. Meanwhile, the shield cracked, and the professor crashed outside the shield, thudding on the floor. His sword also slipped from his hand and fell. While Arthur stood beside him, stabbing his sword into the floor, the professor lying on the floor turned his eyes and looked toward the sword near his neck. Arthur stood beside the professor, placing his hand on his sword handle, and with his glowing eyes looking toward the professor, he thanked him for his guidance. After this, Arthur pulls back his sword in his dimension ring, and then looks toward the students clapping for him. Also, he noticed Princess Catherine, who was steeping the stairs toward the exit door, and then both Arthur and Phainith stepped after her. Arthur, stepping toward her, calls her name as three leave the class. Arthur stepped toward Princess Catherine while Phainith stood behind him, grabbed his shoulder, calling his name. Arthur turns and looks toward Phainith. Also, when Arthur turns, Catherine stands ahead, stops, turns her eyes, and looks toward Arthur. Phainith, with a smiley face, says Arthur admits he was rather impressive back there, as expected of his rival. Sylvia was sitting on Phainith's shoulder. Sylvia jumped toward Arthur, and he caught her answering Phainith. Thanks. He did well out there too. If he had known the type of spell the professor was using, he knows he would have prepared preventative measures. Phainith laughed, adding naturally that he hadn't anticipated he would use such a potent spell in a demonstration. Otherwise, he would have taken the victory. Meanwhile, Princess Catherine comes to them, asking how they would possess her performance. Both of them surprisingly turn and look toward her. Also, Sylvia, whom Arthur holds in his arms, turns her eyes to look at her. Arthur places Sylvia on his shoulder and scratches his head, answering. Well, if he can be blunt, he would say that ignoring her defense to finish that last spell was her biggest mistake. Phainith gets surprised and remains silent, and then Princess Catherine stares at them. After a while, she nods and both Arthur and Phainith laugh. Then she turns and leaves while both of them stand behind her. Phainith laughed, well, he should get going too until next time, his rival. Arthur also moves from there while, on the way, Sylvia sits on his head. She calls him Papa. Arthur heads up to look at her, and she looks toward him and asks why he looks so sad. Arthur, patting her head, answers it with nothing serious. Sylvia, then he gets silent while Sylvia asks him. Arthur stepped ahead to think, seeing as he couldn't finish Geist off quickly with just his mind attributes. He has realized he must work much harder to get where he wants to be. After this, Arthur, stepping ahead with other students, thought he was looking forward to his next class. Suddenly, he realizes that his next class is Basic Artificing. However, this class will teach them to manipulate and code mana to objects for specific uses. Further, he entered the class there. He sat on a moving stool, and sitting there, he thought he didn't have that in his old world. Meanwhile, a green-haired girl comes to him, asking him to excuse her. Is this seat next to him taken? Arthur surprisingly looks toward her. She stands before Arthur, looking toward him, and says she can sit somewhere else if it is. Arthur answers. Then, pointing toward the seat, he says she can sit there if she wishes. Then she sits beside Arthur, thanking him and saying a sentence without taking a break. She hears Arthur looking toward her and surprisingly asks what it is, and she gets a jolt, answering her name Emily Watson. Further, she fearfully asks, please be her friend. She is pleased to meet him, but then gets silent and starts trembling. Arthur surprisingly looks toward her PFFT while she turns her head to stone, thinking he must think she is so weird. Arthur extends his hand toward her, saying he is Arthur, then smiles saying and seeing how this is the first time they have met. Then, extending his hand toward her, he asks how they started as acquaintances. Emily looks toward Arthur, gets emotional, and excitedly nods, then shakes hands with Arthur. Arthur, while grabbing her hands, looks toward her hands, thinking this girl has worked hard because there were calluses on her hand. As he was staring at her hand, she surprisingly looked toward Arthur. Then she quickly pulls back her hand, turns, says she is sorry, and then asks, "It probably feels gross, right?" Arthur answers no, it's pretty fine, with Emily's sad face looking toward Arthur. Then Arthur, showing her his hand, asks if he has calluses to see, and Emily, looking toward Arthur's hand, gets relaxed. Then she, with a smiley face, says he must practice a lot. It's no wonder he is on the disciplinary committee. She admires that. Further, Emily says that she loves artificing, so she fiddles around with many gadgets. Then she, with a smiley face looking toward her hands, says unfortunately it makes her hands pretty rough. Arthur looks toward her hands, smiles, and remains silent. Then he turns his head, asking if he is somewhat jealous. She has a passion for artifice. With fighting, the only things she gets better at are destroying and killing, but with artificing, the better she is, the more things she can create. Emily moves toward her and surprisingly adds she never thought of it that way, but that's quite something coming from a 12-year-old. Arthur laughs, answering she says that as if she isn't 12 herself. She hears Emily turn her head and smiles, adding that it's true, though it's been a while since anyone has said that, not since she created the projection display artifact. Arthur recalled when they gathered for the announcement and thought how old she was when she made that. After this, Arthur, putting his hand on his heart, bends before her, saying he must say it an honor to be in the presence of a genius such as herself. Emily, surprisingly, responds enough. Arthur heads up and looks toward her. Emily moves toward Arthur and, looking in his eyes, shouts come from the mysterious human freshman with no background and a weird fox-looking mana beast. And the ability to overwhelm and completely demolish a professor and a veteran adventurer at the light yellow core stage doesn't make her laugh. As she moves toward Arthur, he sits on a stool, grits his teeth, and moves backward. After telling this, Emily turns back and sits in her seat straight. Sylvia sits at the table and surprisingly looks toward Emily. She sets her glasses and smiles, saying, "Arthur, don't seem so surprised. This is a magic academy after all. News travels fast and gossip travels even faster." Meanwhile, the professor opens the door, enters the class, and blames the door. Then, moving toward the stage, he says, "Greetings, plebeians." All the students turn and look toward the professor. However, this professor was nobody else but Gideon, and he stood before the whiteboard, looking toward the students and saying they may bask in the honor of having him. Then, opening his arms excitedly, he says Professor Gideon is their teacher for this class. He notices Arthur sitting there among the students before him. He surprisingly asks why, if it isn't Arthur Lewin, he had no idea he would be in his class. Arthur looks toward Gideon, thinking of a liar, while all the students in the class turn their heads and look toward Arthur. After this, Professor Gideon turns on the projector and shows the students his inventions. He excitedly points toward the projector and says about 20 years ago he was the one who invented it. Then he changed the picture on the projector, and looking at that picture, he excitedly says he discovered and implemented it 3 years later. Furthermore, he looks toward the students and asks if he mentioned that he was also responsible, while the students sit there impressively looking toward Gideon. While Arthur sits there without expression, he thinks, did he just come there to brag? Meanwhile, a green owl named Avier flaps in the air and enters the class through the window. Sylvia sits there before Arthur turns her eyes and looks toward the Avier. While Avier flies and sits on Arthur's shoulder, Arthur turns his eyes and looks toward the owl. Avier sits on Arthur's shoulder flap while Sylvia angrily approaches the owl. Sylvia angrily looks toward Avier and grits her teeth, saying, "Papa, he is dangerous." Here's Avier surprisingly looks toward Sylvia. However, Professor Gideon and all the students in the classroom surprisingly look toward Avier. Professor Gideon adds that, like the director, Goodsky is beckoned. He guesses he won't be witnessing the rest of his life-changing lecture today, so off he goes. Arthur gets up from their seat, and Emily looks toward him and asks if she told him. News travels fast while he looks toward her and smiles. Sylvia sits on Arthur's shoulder, hits and shouts at Avier while Avier flies backward. After this, Arthur left the class and moved toward Goodsky's office. While on the way, Sylvia and Avier sit on either side of Arthur's shoulder. It was difficult for Sylvia to bear Avier attaching to Arthur, and she snapped her paws at the owl. He sees Arthur stepping ahead and asks how long they will keep fighting. Meanwhile, Arthur notices Princess Cathelm coming out of Goodsky's office. He extends his hand toward her to say hello, but she doesn't notice Arthur standing there. She slams the door and turns. Arthur, with a surprised face, thinks that's not a good sign. While Sylvia and Avier are still fighting, Sylvia moves around on Arthur's shoulder and doesn't let Avier sit on his shoulder. After this, Arthur opened the door and peeked, asking if she had called for him, Director Goodsky. As Arthur opened the door, Avier entered the office. Goodsky doesn't respond, seeing Arthur thinks she looks pissed. After a while, Goodsky gets up and, pointing toward the couch, asks him to sit. Also, Avius goes there and sits on his sitting stand. Goodsky sits on the sofa, and Arthur sits before her on the other couch. Both Arthur and Sylvia are nervous. Arthur adds, look, if this is about his fight with Professor Geist, he only did it because he was using it as he was about to complete his sentence. Goodsky raises her hand, responding she didn't call him there regarding his affairs with Professor Geist. Arthur surprisingly asked then, and she, with a smiley face, putting her hand under her face, stared at him. He again asks then, but she remains silent. Arthur asks a third time, and she, smiling, asks him how he would like to act as an interim professor for his practical mana manipulation class.